My name is Jessica Chen, and for 28 years, I've carried the weight of a mystery that changed my life before I even understood what mysteries were. I was 9 years old in 1995, a fourth grader at Riverside Elementary School in Oregon, when my favorite teacher vanished without a trace during what should have been the most exciting day of our school year. Now at 37, working as an investigative journalist, I finally have the tools and the determination to uncover what really happened to Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell on that foggy October morning in the Cascade Mountains. Mrs. Hartwell was the kind of teacher every child deserves, but few are lucky enough to have. She was in her early 30s then, with warm brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an infectious enthusiasm for learning that made even the most reluctant students eager to participate. She had joined our school just 2 years earlier. Fresh from completing her master's degree in education, she brought with her innovative teaching methods that made our classroom feel more like an adventure than a place of instruction. What made Mrs. Hartwell special wasn't just her ability to make fractions, feel like solving puzzles, or turn history lessons into time travel expeditions. It was the way she saw each of us as individuals, the way she remembered that Tommy struggled with reading but excelled at building things, that Maria was shy in large groups but brilliant in one-on-one discussions, that I had an insatiable curiosity about how things worked and why people made the choices they did. She was the first adult who ever told me I asked good questions. The first person who made me feel like my constant need to understand why was a strength rather than an annoyance. "Never stop being curious, Jessica," she would tell me when I peppered her with questions that went far beyond our lesson plans. The world needs people who aren't satisfied with easy answers. The field trip to Mount Hood National Forest was supposed to be the culmination of our month-long unit on ecosystems and environmental science. Mrs. Hartwell had been planning it for weeks, coordinating with park rangers, preparing detailed itineraries, and teaching us about the different plants and animals we might encounter. She was more excited than any of us, talking about how we would get to see the principles we'd been studying come alive in the real world. I remember the morning we left with crystal clarity. October 13th, 1995. The school bus arrived at 6:30. In the morning, and despite the early hour, all 24 of us fourth graders were bouncing with excitement. Mrs. Hartwell stood at the front of the bus as we loaded on, checking her clipboard and making sure everyone had their lunch bags and permission slips. She was wearing her favorite green sweater, the one she always wore when she was particularly excited about a lesson, and her long brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had her camera hanging around her neck, an old 35mm that she'd brought to document our adventure, and her ever-present tote bag, filled with field guides and nature journals for us to use. "Today's going to be magical," she announced. As the bus pulled away from the school, "We're going to see things that will make everything we've learned come alive. Remember to keep your eyes open and your minds curious." The 2-hour drive to the forest passed in a blur of excited chatter and Mrs. Hartwell leading us in songs and nature trivia games. She pointed out landmarks through the windows, explained how the landscape changed as we gained elevation, and helped us spot different types of trees and rock formations. When we arrived at the ranger station, we met our guide for the day, Ranger Patricia Williams, a cheerful woman in her 40s who had worked in the forest for over 15 years. She and Mrs. Hartwell had spoken several times over the phone to plan our route. I could see they had developed an easy rapport. "Your teacher has planned an amazing day for you," Ranger Williams told us as we gathered around the information kiosk. "We're going to hike the Eagle Creek Trail, which will take us past waterfalls, through old-growth forest, into some of the most beautiful viewpoints in the Pacific Northwest." The trail started easily enough, a wide path that wound gently through towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks. Mrs. Hartwell moved among us like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, pointing out interesting plants, encouraging the slower hikers, reminding us to stay together, helping us identify bird calls and animal tracks. About an hour into our hike, we reached the first waterfall, a stunning cascade that dropped over musk-covered rocks into a crystal-clear pool below. This was where Mrs. Hartwell had planned our first major stop, where we would break into small groups to complete observation exercises in our nature journals. "I want everyone to find a comfortable spot where you can see the waterfall clearly," Mrs. Hartwell called out over the sound of rushing water. "Spend the next 15 minutes drawing what you see and writing down 3 things you notice about how water shapes the landscape around it. I found a fallen log near the edge of the viewing area, close enough to feel the mist from the waterfall on my face. As I worked on my journal entry, I kept glancing up to watch Mrs. Hartwell moving among the other students, helping them with their observations, asking questions that pushed them to look deeper. That's when I noticed him. There was a man standing at the far edge of our group, partially hidden behind a cluster of large boulders. He wasn't wearing the typical hiking gear that most forest visitors had on, and he seemed to be watching our group with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. He was maybe 40 years old, with dark hair and a beard, wearing a heavy jacket despite the mild October weather. When Mrs. Hartwell approached the students near where he was standing, I saw him step forward and say something to her. She paused, looked surprised, then walked a few steps away from the group to continue their conversation. From where I sat, I couldn't hear what they were discussing, but I could see Mrs. Hartwell's body language change from her usual relaxed confidence to something that looked like concern or confusion. After a few minutes, Mrs. Hartwell returned to the group, but something was different. She seemed distracted, checking her watch repeatedly and glancing back toward where the man had been standing. But when I looked for him, he was gone. "All right, everyone," Mrs. Hartwell called out, her voice carrying a note of urgency that hadn't been there before. "Let's gather up our things and continue on the trail. Ranger Williams is waiting for us at the next checkpoint." As we packed up our journals and prepared to move on, Mrs. Hartwell approached Ranger Williams and spoke to her quietly. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw Ranger Williams nod and point further up the trail. "Mrs. Hartwell needs to check on something quickly," Ranger Williams announced to our group. "I'm going to continue with you to the next viewing area, and she'll catch up with us there in just a few minutes." Mrs. Hartwell gave us all a bright smile, but I noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes the way her smiles usually did. "I'll see you all very soon," she said. "Listen to Ranger Williams and stay together." She shouldered her tote bag, adjusted her camera strap, and headed back down the trail in the direction we had come from, walking quickly and purposefully. I watched her green sweater disappear around a bend in the path. That was the last time anyone ever saw Eleanor Hartwell, when she didn't appear at the designated meeting spot after 30 minutes. Ranger Williams began to look concerned. After an hour, she radioed for backup. By afternoon, search teams were combing the forest. By evening, Mrs. Hartwell's disappearance had become a full-scale missing persons investigation. The search continued for weeks. Professional search and rescue teams, volunteers from the community, and even students' families joined the effort to find our beloved teacher. They found her car in the parking lot where she had left it that morning. They found her camera, apparently, dropped near the trail not far from where we had last seen her. They never found Mrs. Hartwell. The official investigation concluded that she had likely suffered some kind of accident, perhaps fallen into a ravine or become lost in the dense forest. The theory was that she had stepped off the trail for some reason, possibly to investigate something or help someone, and had encountered misfortune in the challenging terrain. But even at 9 years old, I knew that explanation didn't fit what I had observed. Mrs. Hartwell was an experienced hiker who had grown up in Oregon and knew these forests well. She was careful and responsible, not the type to wander off unprepared. And most importantly, she had been talking to that strange man just before she disappeared. I tried to tell the police about what I had seen. My account was dismissed as the confused memories of a traumatized child. The investigating officers were kind but patronizing, explaining that sometimes our minds play tricks on us during stressful situations, and that I might be combining memories from different parts of the day. Mrs. Hartwell's disappearance changed everything for our class, our school, and our community. We had a series of substitute teachers for the rest of the year, none of whom could fill the void she had left. Parents became more protective and suspicious. Field trips were canceled indefinitely. The joy and trust that had characterized our educational experience was replaced by fear and uncertainty. But for me, Mrs. Hartwell's disappearance became something more than just a tragedy. It became a calling. Her words about curiosity and not accepting easy answers echoed in my mind as I grew older. I found myself drawn to unsolved mysteries. Two stories where the official explanation didn't quite fit all the facts. Two situations where someone needed an advocate who wouldn't give up. I studied journalism in college, specializing in investigative reporting. I learned how to research public records, how to interview reluctant witnesses, how to piece together complex timelines from scattered evidence. I worked for newspapers and magazines, covering everything from political corruption to cold cases, always carrying with me the memory of the teacher who had encouraged my curiosity and the mystery that had never been solved. As the 28th anniversary of Mrs. Hartwell's disappearance approached last year, I made a decision that would change everything. I took a leave of absence from my job at the Portland Tribune and dedicated myself full-time to investigating what had really happened to Eleanor Hartwell in the Cascade Mountains in 1995. I started by tracking down everyone who had been involved in the original investigation. Many of the police officers had retired, some had died, but I was able to locate Detective Robert Morrison, who had been the lead investigator on the case. He was in his 70s now, living in a retirement community outside Portland, and he agreed to meet with me to discuss the case. I remember that case, he told me, as we sat in his small apartment, surrounded by boxes of old case files he had kept after his retirement. It bothered me for years. 28 years later, and it still bothers me. There were things about it that never quite added up. Detective Morrison pulled out a thick folder labeled Hartwell, Eleanor Missing Person 1995, and spread its contents across his kitchen table. Police reports, witness statements, search records, photographs from the scene, everything that remained of the official investigation into Mrs. Hartwell's disappearance. You were just a kid then, but you were the only witness who mentioned seeing someone talking to your teacher before she vanished, he said, pointing to a report with my 9-year-old statement. Problem was, nobody else saw this man you described, and we couldn't find any evidence he existed. But what if he did exist? I asked. What if the other kids were too focused on their assignments to notice? Or what if he deliberately stayed out of sight of most of the group? Detective Morrison leaned back in his chair and studied me with the same intensity I remembered from 28 years earlier. I'll tell you something I never put in the official report, he said finally. 3 days after your teacher disappeared, we got a call from a woman who lived about 10 miles from where you had been hiking. She said a man matching the description you gave had approached her property that same day, asking about using her. Phoned because his car had broken down? My heart began racing. What happened? Did you follow up? We tried to, but by the time we got out there to interview her properly, she had changed her story, said she was mistaken, that it had been a different day, that the man looked nothing like your description. She seemed scared, like someone had gotten to her. Detective Morrison reached into the folder and pulled out a photograph I had never seen before, a police sketch based on my childhood description of the man I had seen talking to Mrs. Hartwell. Looking at it now, with adult eyes and 28 years of experience, something clicked in my mind. The face in the sketch looked familiar in a way that had nothing to do with my memories of that day in the forest. Detective Morrison, do you still have the records of everyone who was questioned during the investigation? He pulled out another thick file. Everyone we could identify. Other hikers who were in the area that day, people who worked at the ranger station, local residents. We cast a pretty wide net. As I flipped through the witness statements and interview records, I found what I was looking for. 3 days after Mrs. Hartwell disappeared, police had interviewed a local man named David Patterson, who had been seen in the area that morning. He had claimed to be hiking alone, said he hadn't seen our group or noticed anything unusual. The photograph attached to his statement made my blood run cold. It was him. The man I had seen talking to Mrs. Hartwell 28 years earlier was David Patterson, and he had lied to the police about not seeing our group. Detective Morrison, I said, my voice shaking slightly, I think I know who took my teacher. The investigation that followed consumed the next 6 months of my life. Working with Detective Morrison, who came out of retirement to help solve the case that had haunted him for decades, I began to piece together a picture of David Patterson that revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior. Patterson had been in his early 40s in 1995, living alone in a cabin deep in the national forest where he worked as a handyman and odd-job contractor. He had no permanent address, no steady employment, and a history of moving frequently between small communities throughout Oregon and Washington. Most disturbing of all, we discovered that Patterson had been questioned in connection with 2 other missing persons cases in the Pacific Northwest during the 1990s, both involving young women who had disappeared while hiking or camping alone. In both cases, witnesses had reported seeing a man matching Patterson's description in the area around the time of the disappearances. There had never been enough evidence to charge him with any crime. The break in the case came when I decided to visit the property where the woman had reported seeing Patterson on the day Mrs. Hartwell disappeared. The current owners had bought the land in 2003, but they allowed me to search the property and speak with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Ruth Campbell, who had lived in the area her entire life. "Oh, I remember that whole business," Mrs. Campbell told me as we sat on her front porch, looking out over the forest where Mrs. Hartwell had vanished. "Scared everyone around here half to death. Poor woman just disappeared into thin air." "Do you remember anything about a man named David Patterson? He might have been in the area around that time." Mrs. Campbell's expression changed immediately. David Patterson. Now that's a name I haven't heard in years. He used to do work around here sometimes, chopping wood, fixing fences, that sort of thing. Kept to himself mostly, but there was something about him that never sat right with me. "What do you mean?" "Well, for one thing, he had this old cabin up in the hills that nobody was supposed to know about. Built it on Forest Service land without any permits, hid it way back where the logging roads peter out. And for another thing, he was always watching. People, women especially, made them uncomfortable." Mrs. Campbell went on to tell me something that made my heart race with excitement and terror. In the months following Mrs. Hartwell's disappearance, she had occasionally seen smoke rising from the area where Patterson's illegal cabin was located. Even though everyone believed he had left the area after being questioned by police, I always wondered if he was still around, hiding out up there. But the police seemed satisfied that he had moved on, and nobody wanted to go hiking around in those hills looking for trouble. Armed with this information, Detective Morrison and I contacted the current sheriff's department and convinced them to organize a search of the area Mrs. Campbell had described. Using GPS coordinates and satellite imagery, we were able to identify the most likely locations for Patterson's hidden cabin. The search took place on a gray February morning, exactly 28 years and 4 months after Mrs. Hartwell's disappearance. I was allowed to accompany the search team as a journalist, though I was warned to stay back and let the professionals handle any discoveries. We found the cabin after 3 hours of hiking through dense forest and underbrush. It was exactly as Mrs. Campbell had described: a small, crude structure built from salvaged lumber and hidden in a grove of old-growth trees, where it couldn't be seen from any trail or road. The roof had partially collapsed from years of neglect, and blackberry vines had grown over much of the structure. But it was clearly the remnant of someone's long-term hideout. What we found inside changed everything. In a wooden crate buried beneath decades of debris and forest litter, search teams discovered a collection of items that had belonged to Mrs. Hartwell. Her wire-rimmed glasses, the green sweater she had been wearing that day, her leather tote bag with her teaching materials still inside, and most heartbreaking of all, a journal she had been keeping that chronicled her thoughts about teaching and her hopes for her students' futures. But the most significant discovery was a series of photographs that Patterson had apparently taken without Mrs. Hartwell's knowledge. Images of her working in her classroom, walking to her car after school, shopping at the local grocery store, evidence of a stalking pattern that had been going on for months before she disappeared. The final photograph in the collection was taken on the day of our field trip. It showed Mrs. Hartwell talking to Patterson near the waterfall, and her body language clearly indicated distress and fear. This wasn't a chance encounter or a request for help, as the official investigation had theorized. This was a predator who had been watching his victim and had chosen that isolated location to make his move. David Patterson was never arrested for Mrs. Hartwell's disappearance. By the time we made these discoveries, he had been dead for 15 years, having died in a car accident in Montana in 2008. But the evidence was clear enough for authorities to officially close the case and acknowledge that Eleanor Hartwell had been the victim of a kidnapping and likely murder, not an accidental disappearance as originally concluded. The hardest part of this entire investigation was the phone call I had to make to Mrs. Hartwell's younger sister, Linda, who had never stopped hoping that Eleanor might someday be found alive. Linda was living in California now, married with children of her own. But she had maintained a website dedicated to finding her missing sister and had never given up hope that she might still be out there somewhere. "Jessica," she said when I called to tell her what we had discovered, "Eleanor talked about you all the time. She said you were the most curious student she had ever taught, always asking the questions that made everyone think deeper. She would be so proud to know that. You never stopped asking questions about what happened to her." Linda asked me to meet her at Mrs. Hartwell's grave in Portland. The family had placed a headstone years earlier, despite never recovering her body. We stood there together on a sunny spring morning, two women connected by love for a teacher, who had changed our lives, finally able to say goodbye knowing that the truth had been revealed. "She used to tell me about her students," Linda said as we placed fresh flowers on the grave. "She said teaching wasn't just about sharing knowledge, it was about inspiring people to keep learning, keep questioning, keep growing long after they left her classroom. She said the greatest gift a teacher could give a student was curiosity that would last a lifetime." As I write this now, almost a year after solving the mystery that had haunted me for 28 years, I realize that Mrs. Hartwell's final lesson was the most important one she ever taught me. She showed me that some questions are worth pursuing even when everyone else has given up looking for answers. That curiosity and persistence can ultimately triumph over injustice and cover-ups. And that the people we love never truly leave us. As long as we carry forward the lessons they taught us, the official investigation into Mrs. Hartwell's disappearance is closed now, but her legacy lives on in ways the investigators never documented. I've heard from dozens of her former students over the past year, people who credited her with inspiring their careers, their life choices, their commitment to asking difficult questions and seeking truth in a world that often prefers comfortable lies. Mrs. Hartwell never got to see her students grow up, never got to know how profoundly she had shaped our lives, never got to experience the joy of watching curious 9-year-olds become thoughtful adults who refuse to accept easy answers. But through her teaching and her example, she created something that outlasted her life, a group of people committed to curiosity, truth, and justice. David Patterson may have taken Mrs. Hartwell's life, but he couldn't take away her influence or her legacy. Every question I ask as a journalist, every investigation I pursue, every truth I help uncover is a continuation of the lesson she began teaching me in that fourth-grade classroom 30 years ago. The world needs people who aren't satisfied with easy answers, she had told me. Now, I understand that she wasn't just talking about academic curiosity. She was talking about the moral obligation we have to keep asking questions when something doesn't seem right, to keep searching for truth even when it's difficult or dangerous, to never give up on the people who matter to us, even when everyone else has moved on. Eleanor Hartwell vanished on a mountain trail in 1995, at her most important lesson that curiosity and persistence can change the world lives on in every student she ever taught to ask better questions. And sometimes, 28 years later, those questions finally lead to answers that bring justice, closure, and the peace that comes from knowing the truth.